I'm speaking tonight on behalf of Social Scientists Against Hostile Environment. As a group, we have produced a report and organized a series of seminars, webinars really. Details of the report and our upcoming as well as previous events are available on our website. So if you're interested in, please have a look. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you all, and especially to our speakers, Colin Prescott, Malcolm Richards, and Nia Yuval Davis. Our topic, Imposing Racialized State Discourses, Racism in Britain Today, is designed to interrogate practices of state racism and how to combat them. I'm going to speak for about 5 minutes on the theme for the evening, and this will be followed by Floya Anthias, who will introduce the speakers. At the end of the presentations by the speakers, there will be an opportunity for Q&A fielded by Rachel Rosen. Over the years, British state responses to racism have been contradictory. On the one hand, racism have been aided and fueled by state policies and practices in fields such as policing and immigration control. On the other hand, anti-discrimination legislation in the form of Race Relations Act or later the Equalities Act 2010, and the work of liaison and conciliatory bodies such as the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, these operate with the stated aim to, in quotes, promote equality and challenge discrimination on grounds of race, gender reassignment, and I'm quoting here, disability, sexual orientation, religion or belief, and age, as well as human rights issues. So the Commission has a comprehensive agenda, but the critical question is, how will it discharge its remit? We already know that the Equalities Commission has recently appointed Jessica Butcher and David Goodhart to its Board of Commissioners for a period of 4 years from 1st December 2020. Controversially, as we all know, David Goodhart, in his 2000 book, The British Dream, Success and Failures of Post-War Immigration, argues that high immigration can undermine national solidarity and be a threat to social democratic ideals. He strongly favors a curb on immigration. More recently, in 2018, he suggested that the Windrush Scandal should not lead to the watering down of the hostile environment. Similarly, board member Jessica Butcher has criticized the Me Too movement and argued that, and I quote, victim narrative of modern feminism disempowers women, she argues. In other words, these appointments of prominent figures from the political right of the political spectrum raise questions about the future political direction of IHRA. In the field of education, more than 80 leading academics have criticized the government for misrepresenting critical race theory in their crackdown on teaching materials in schools. The guidance produced by the Department for Education bars schools from using resources produced by organizations which supposedly take extreme political stances. And these organizations, believe it or not, for them include Black Lives Matter and Extinction Rebellion. These government interventions are stifling debate and critical thinking. A similar example is highlighted by the incident that was dubbed Operation Trojan Horse. In this case, the educational authorities alleged that there was a conspiracy by teachers to introduce Islamist and Salafist, and these are their words, ethos in several schools in Birmingham. The Department of Education initially responded with lifetime bans imposed against some teachers in 2015. But most of these were overturned, dropped, and or dismissed in courts. In 2017, expert witnesses in the professional misconduct cases in the Trojan Horse affair described the allegations as false narrative spread by a hostile press, which led to a very serious miscarriage of justice against the teachers. Likewise, as we know, there has been the Windrush Scandal, involving mainly people with Caribbean heritage who were wrongly detained, denied legal rights, and threatened with deportation. In at least 83 cases, individuals were wrongly deported by the Home Office. When the campaign against those actions became well established and politically visible, the government conceded that serious mistakes had been made, and the case still continues. These examples, I'm giving these examples basically to show some of the varying and variable shapes and forms taken by state racism in Britain today. Their violence is palpable. The webinar aims to foreground the impact of these racisms and ask such questions as what anti-racist policies and practices are necessary to overcome the dire effects of different racisms? What strategies of resistance should we collectively develop against racialized inequities and inequalities and forward, and not forward, but and toward radical social transformation? What are the central issues relating to the role of EHRC? How should we address anti-Jewish racism? These are the types of questions, and obviously there will be many more questions and questions that our speakers obviously will have thought about and would like to share with us. The problem of multiple racisms facing us today is incredibly urgent. Our speakers are extremely well placed to highlight strategies for eliminating racism. And now I'll pass on to Floya, who will introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Tara. Yes, well, you've set the ground very well. So I'm going to just introduce the speakers. We've got three speakers today. Malcolm Richards, who will be talking about legacy work, Black educators' resistance and anti-racism in hostile education. Neera Yuval Davis, who will be talking about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and racialized discourses in Britain, and Colin Prescott, who will be talking about the state, the hostile environment and Black lives, the case for insurgent social science intervention. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the first speaker, Malcolm Richards, and then when he's finished, and he'll be talking for about 13 to 15 minutes, I will introduce the second speaker, and then after that, the third speaker. So Malcolm Richards, we're very happy to have you here today. Thank you very much for coming. Malcolm Richards is a co-founder of the Black Educators Alliance, an anti-racist network of Black educators committed to radically transforming inequitable structures and institutions. Along with a coalition of anti-racist educators, BEA has launched legal action against the government to challenge new guidelines for the teaching of relationships and sex education, stating schools must not use materials from anti-capitalist groups, promote victim narratives, or make certain accusations against state institutions. Malcolm is a secondary school teacher, a trade union activist, and a doctoral researcher at the University of Exeter. His research adopts a critical autoethnographic approach, examining how progressive educators apply funds of resistance through digital resources from Black cultural education domains to facilitate critical dialogue in UK schools. He is the founder and director of the Culture Yard, UK, a cultural community and social justice education project in the southwest of England, and co-editor of Beyond the Blockade Education in Cuba, 2020. Malcolm, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Floya, for that introduction. I was smiling throughout with a bit of embarrassment because I never usually hear myself described in such such a fantastic way. So I appreciate it, but I have to acknowledge, I will acknowledge the work of so many others while I'm speaking. First of all, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We appreciate it, especially in these times, and I really want to thank the community for allowing me an opportunity to speak and to represent, hopefully, others. I'm going to start a timer so I don't go on too long. What I'm going to hopefully do today is root a perspective, some thoughts around a lot of the legacy work that has happened over the so many years. I'm going to root it first in the present. I'm going to go to the past, and then hopefully, in the space of these 12 minutes or so, I'm going to shoot into the future. Before I do that, I want to say I hope everybody is well, and in these times, take time and look after yourselves. I also want to acknowledge the contribution of so many of the people who have inspired me and inspired others in terms of teaching anti-racist work, social justice work. Some of them are with us, some of them are young and doing great work, and others have passed. In particular, I want to acknowledge the contribution of Yvonne Connolly, who recently passed and is widely acknowledged as Britain's first Black head teacher. So I'm going to start as I said, I'm going to start in the present. And so before I came on this call, I run my mum. I speak to my mum. I live in Devon. My mum lives in Buckinghamshire, and I haven't seen her in 6-7 months or so. And so I wanted to connect with her. She's a teacher. She's a retired teacher. And often when we speak about the state of the world, state of the nation, and themes of activism in and around our community. I describe myself, or I was described as a black teacher, a black educator, and I would use that language in terms of my work as a trade union activist within the National Education Union, which adopts generally a political definition of blackness. I will talk about being a black teacher in terms of my role within the academy. I do some research and some teaching within that space, and a teacher within my communities as well. And that final definition doesn't require doctorate, MA, PGCE, or any formal qualification. The way in which we teach and educate is done in a variety of different ways in a variety of different spaces. I also acknowledge, of course, many of our parents now, through the process of homeschooling, are engaged in some of those educational practices. And the reason why I wanted to speak to my mum was really just to think about what I was going to say today. I will often speak, and I speak from the heart. But I wanted to talk about the role of policy and surveillance in many ways, and that's kind of gets to the heart of things. As part of the BEA community, along with CARE, a small group of teachers, less than 20, maybe, decided in about September last year to engage or instigate an action, which we didn't know what it was, but it was to challenge this guidance from the government, which related to the SSAHE curriculum, which was outlined before. And when we did that during this lockdown period, we did this via social media and via digital contact, and we simply just engaged in work. There wasn't much time for discussion or debate. We knew this was something that was wrong. We knew that it couldn't stand. We were looking around to see who were the institutions that were going to make this challenge on our behalf. Where are the voices that are going to challenge? And there was a lot of voices saying this was wrong, but we recognized, I think, very quickly, we needed to do some action about this. And so we did, quite simply. And I'll get onto the outcomes at the end of that. But when we were speaking about this, this small community of less than 20 teachers, we spoke about the reasons why we're in this position at the moment. We tried to unpick that, and we linked it directly to this phrase that I'm using, legacy work. And I'm going to shout out Zara Bay from No More Exclusions and Care to Liberate for kind of coming up with this phrase. And it links to the connection of the work that we're doing now in this digital age to the work that has been done for generations by our teachers, and those voices haven't necessarily been heard in our big institutions, within our universities, within our course designs, within our curriculum designs. Some of them have, but not all of them. When I speak to my mum on a regular basis, and in particular over the last two to 3 weeks, our mind goes, or my mind and her mind certainly goes to the legacy of that period between 1980 and 1982. As I'm sure many on the call will be aware, January marked the 40th anniversary of the New Cross fire, and then within 2 weeks of that was the Black Day of Action. And my mum speaks about that time with great humility and sadness, because in many ways it was a point in history that really mobilized her to engage with activist movements, to engage, to become a teacher, literally to retrain. And that thread continues. And so it has been really positive to see a newer generation of activists, young people, beginning to find out about some of those legacies. Some of those stories are often erased from a lot of our activist work. We don't tell those stories in some of our educational spaces, so it's interesting to hear about those. Similarly, when we move into 1981 and those themes of uprising in Brixton, Toxteth and Chapeltown and across the UK, when my mum and my other elders reflect on that period, they talk about it as a point of difficulty but also galvanization and transformation. They speak about my mum spoke about the policies that kind of were enacted, the various government informed reports, whether it's Scarman or others, which claim to recognize some of the complex political and social factors that caused some of these uprisings and some of these events, but fundamentally rejected the ideas of institutional racism. Just as I describe that section and I hear it in my head, I immediately think of the present, and I think of some of the language that's being used when we're talking about lots of this reporting and guidance and institutional responses to what I describe as structural and institutional racism, which is rooted in the colonizing and colonial ideal, quite simply. But when we're talking about critical race theory, when we're talking about engaging with Black Lives Matters and other communities, decoloniality groups, environmental groups who are offering critical reflections, critical discussions around the state of education today, whether we're talking at primary school, whether we're talking in our key stage 3, 4, or even FE or HE, we're seeing almost a repetition of the language that's used. The events of last year, 7th of June 2020 in particular, in Bristol and Colston, are quickly in many spaces and circles being seen as a watershed moment, a moment in which there was this great critical consciousness that had occurred amongst many of our young people. I live in Devon, as I said, so I live in a part of the country which is pretty much a monoculture. And for many, it was hard to see how on earth spaces like Shepton Mallet or Truro, these are all towns in the far southwest, could be engaged with movements like Black Lives Matters and others. And I'm looking at my time just to check where I am, sorry. And what is completely, or what largely absent from the narratives, is that this hostile environment that we talk about has always been here. It didn't go away. It hasn't just been formulated with coalition policies. It's always been here. Critically, Black and anti-racist educators have been at the forefront of challenging that hostile environment. The work that I would argue, the work that those communities have done for generations is in part the reason why so many young people were mobilized to take action last year. That is testament to the work, but the work doesn't continue. As many of us have seen over the last year or so, we've seen teachers fighting to become more conscious. We've seen academics more engaged with themes of social justice, anti-racism, decoloniality, Black studies and cultural studies. If I very quickly talk about my own context in the far Southwest, Black educators are mobilized. There is a further galvanizing of the anti-racist and social justice community. But the most impressive, awe-inspiring, humbling thing that has occurred is that our young people are demanding that our institutions change. They are demanding that our teaching practice change. I need to, at this point, give a shout out to the Exeter Decolonizing Network, who are doing amazing work at the University of Exeter. I need to also shout out some of the communities in Bristol, Plymouth, and places which, if we think about our often London-centric focus, I'm a Londoner, which is why I'm saying this, we don't think about the work being done in those places. But testament to the power of the work is, for example, Angela Davis doing a speech very recently at the University of Exeter with the Exeter Decolonizing Network. A testimony to the legacy of that work is BEA and CARE being able to literally take on the government in terms of this PSHE guidance, and eventually, through us galvanizing support from amazing people who were prepared to donate their own money, for us trying to fight with some of our institutions, including our unions, to support the movement, we literally we were in the position where the government have actually said that they will change their guidance. I'm not suggesting that we won. We're not patting ourselves on the back, but it is testament to that legacy work and the legacy work of all of those groups, individuals, and communities that I mentioned that literally offers us a glimpse of transformation. But there is a cost to this. As we shift into our digital world and our digital spaces, the spaces that are available for assembly for Black educators are reducing drastically. The spaces for anti-racist educators are reducing drastically. The ways in which we are being surveilled in our teaching through presenting online, talking in spaces where we may be accused of saying something which is deemed as problematic, which incites prevent, also becomes problematic. The key thing that I would say, and almost to conclude, whether I'm talking about the legacy work of the past, the work in the present, or the work of the future, there has always, in my view, been at its heart love, care, humility, and bravery. The work comes at a cost, and those who do it demonstrate it. The thing that gives me absolute hope for the future is seeing young people mobilized up and down the country in continuing the work, and continuing the work inside the institutions and outside. They're not necessarily relying on formal organized spaces. They're not necessarily relying on academics to do the research. They're doing it themselves. Our role, in many ways, has to be to support their movements. Get out of the way, otherwise we're going to be run over with their movement and their way. And I'm here to support young people, students, and those who are prepared to fight in that transformative action. I'm going to stop there because I could have gone on for a long time. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. thank you for staying to the time limit, and also thank you for talking to us in such an engaging way with forms of resistance to a hostile environment, which, as you rightly say, is not new, although it was named a hostile environment more recently under Theresa May. But certainly where there is racism, there is hostile environment, as we know. So now we're going to move on to our second speaker, Neera Ewell Davis, and Neera will be talking about the, as I said before, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and racialized discourses in Britain. Neera is Professor Emeritus and Honorary Director of the Research Centre on Migration, Refugees and Belonging, or CMRB, as we fondly know it, at the University of East London. She's a diasporic Israeli socialist feminist who's been active in different forms against racism and sexism in Israel and other settler colonial states, as well as in the UK and other European countries. She's been the president of the ISA Research Committee 05 on racism, nationalism, indigeneity and ethnic relations. She's been a founder of and member of the Women Against Fundamentalism, as well as Social Scientists Against the Hostile Environment, where we are today. She's also a member of the education group of Jewish Voice for Labour. She won the 2018 International Sociological Association Distinguished Award for Excellence in Research and Practice, and has written widely on intersected gendered nationalisms, racisms, fundamentalisms, citizenships, identities, belongings, and everyday bordering. So a wide range of work. And her most recent book, she's written a lot of books, but her most recent book is a co-authored book, Bordering, in 2019. And her 1984 Spare Rib article, Anti-Semitism, Zionism, and the Struggle Against Racism, was republished in Feminist Review in 2019, and she's been translated into more than 10 languages. Neera, the floor is yours. We can't hear you. Neera, we can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself. Neera.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yep.
yes.
Yeah, okay, apologies. And thank you, Floria, a very long time, both friend and colleague with whom a lot of my formative ideas about work on issues of racism, sexism, and other things have been formed in our very long time together. Today, I'm very glad actually that we are in a pandemic and can have webinar looking at the snow and ice outside. But of course, it has affected all kinds of work. But in other words, in other ways, it has managed to make us work beyond place and location in a more flexible way, which I think is very important. I want to talk to you about the ways that contemporary Tory government is promoting particularly discourse on what is racism and how it should be fought. Of course, this is not just something which was started by this government, but certain issues and controversies have been sharpened under it. In my presentation, I'm going to focus on some of the issues which are relating to anti-Semitism, or rather, as I prefer to call it, anti-Jewish racism. What I'm most going to focus on is the what I would call Jewish exceptionalism, which already can be reflected by the fact that it's called anti-Semitism rather anti-Jewish racism, and to describe some of the ways that I would argue this Jewish exceptionalism is detrimental to the solidarity between Jews and other racialized groupings. One of the most controversial recent acts of exceptionalism has been enacted by the Minister of Education, Gavin Williamson, when he wrote to the Vice-Chancellors of all British universities demanding, with a threat of sanctions, that they adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism. There are many issues to be concerned about regarding this act of Williamson, including the issues of freedom of speech that the new head of the Equal Human Rights Commission, Baroness Faulkner, pointed out, as well as claiming, and I commend her for that this definition is extremely poorly worded and probably unactionable in law. I'll come back to some aspect of that definition later in my presentation. But Flora mentioned the Jewish Voice for Labor. They have done very good work on the critique of this definition. And recently, a group of Israeli academics working in Britain initiated and have written an excellent letter. I can say that it's excellent because although I was involved in the group, I was not part of those who actually wrote it. And almost 140 of us have teaching in Britain and in other places have signed it. I can put afterwards in the chat the link to this collective letter. Most relevant to my point here, however, is that Williamson did not demand that the universities would adopt a single definition of any other form of racism, only anti-Semitism. This act of exceptionalism, in addition to everything else, construct an artificial division between racism against Jews and racism against other racialized groupings. This form of Jewish exceptionalism is not alone in the British state. For example, the Holocaust Memorial Day. Don't misunderstand me. Most of my extended family members were murdered by the Nazis during that time, and the emotional and intellectual impact of this have had on me have played a major role in my formation as an anti-racist activist. More than that, as a teacher of the sociology of racism, I've always insisted to teach racism against Jews, Roma, Irish refugees, as well as racism against Blacks, as was a custom then in sociology curriculum. And the introduction of teaching in schools about the Holocaust in the 1990s has had an important positive effect on ingrained anti-Jewish stereotyping, which I've encountered among my students until then. However, introducing a Holocaust Memorial Day in the UK, as Max Silverman and I have written in an article at the time that was vetoed from The Guardian, and even in the journal Ethnicities, Tariq Mudud agreed to publish it only as part of a debate with Robert Wistridge. What we argue is that when there have been no other memorial days to other acts of genocides and racism in Britain, this has been problematic in several important ways, of which I'll mention now two. First, this is against the issue of Jewish exceptionalism. While I know that many anti-racist activists, Jewish and non-Jewish, when they memorialize the Holocaust Day these days, are expanding the range of genocides and other crimes against humanity which are memorialized, the fact that it was called the Holocaust Memorial Day and not Genocide Memorial Day, for instance, retained the Holocaust as historically the archetype case that of all genocides that all other cases have to be measured against. Moreover, as the UK was never occupied by the Nazis, it was easy for it to focus on the Nazi Holocaust rather than on some of the horrendous things that took place during the British Empire, as the Black Lives Matter movement have finally managed, I hope, to start making an impact in this regard. A very different act of Jewish exceptionalism is a way that the chief rabbi is an ex officio have a place in the House of Lords, the only non-Christian religious lord who has such a place. Never mind that the chief rabbi represents only one stream among several different streams of Jewish worship, let alone all those Jews who are not religious, and that it reinforces the problematic constructions of Jewishness as religion. This relates to another case of Jewish exceptionalism, which has been important currently during the pandemic. In the National Statistics Census, Jewishness is mentioned only as a religion, not as an ethnicity. I usually used to have to tick the category Chinese and other when asked for my ethnic origin. There have been lots of publications about the unproportional vulnerability to the COVID among what they call the BAME communities. However, all reports about the extremely high proportion of the, for example, ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in Stratford Hill cannot be integrated in these statistics, as the counselor in Hackney explained to me, because they are ingrained in among the white English. There are many forms of racism. Any signifier of collectivity boundaries, from the color of the skin to an accent or mode of clothing and many others, can construct racialized, immutable boundaries which can be used to either, often both, logics of racism, that of exclusion, the ultimate form of which is genocide, and that of exploitation, the ultimate logic of which is slavery. In Britain today, as we discuss the introductory, as we discuss in the introductory part of the SSAHE's report, Migration, Racism in Hostile Environment, with which we launched SSAHE, three kinds of racialized discourses dominate. Those stemming from European cultural history, both religious and scientific eugenistic, imperial, those stemming from the British colonial and slavery history, and nativist, relating to anti-immigration populist movement who want to keep Britain only to those who belong. Different specific forms of racist discourse, anti-Black, anti-Roma, anti-Muslim, etc., draw in different ways and to different extent in different historical times from these traditions. Like anti-Black racism, analysis of anti-Semitic discourses show that it is rooted in both religious and scientific tradition in Europe and has been constitutive of the European narrative of collective belonging. And while anti-Muslim and anti-Arab racisms have tended to focus on this as dangers from without, the Jews were constituted as dangers from within. However, at particular historical times, for example, at the beginning of the 20th century, anti-Jewish racism has drawn on nativist narratives of belonging, as in the anti-alien social movement and legislation at early 20th century, and the question of assimilation. So anti-Semitism is particularly identified with the conspiratorial worldview and the falsely personalized embodiment of the abstract dimensions of capitalist power. Of course, all these constructions of anti-Semitism and other forms of racism homogenize and reify the racialized groupings, and the first task of anti-racist is to analyze all these issues historically and in an intersectional manner. This brings me back to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which the British Education Minister had been trying to impose. Because this definition legitimizes Jewish exceptionalism also in a different way, a way which I would argue is ultimately very dangerous to Jews, especially certain kind of Jews themselves. I need only to mention in this context that at the moment, many, if not the majority, of the Labour Party members who are being suspended from the party because of accusations of anti-Semitism are themselves Jews. The Labour Party, unfortunately itself, has adopted the IHRA definition, and this is a direct result from this adoption under the leadership of Keir Starmer. The IHRA definition, which has been defined by those who composed it only as a working definition of anti-Semitism, and not as the ultimate authority as could have been assumed, relies mostly on illustrative examples, and quite a few of these relate to condemnation of Israel. Indeed, in addition to the major forms of anti-Semitism I mentioned before, in the 21st century, there is a growing hegemony of what they call the new anti-Semitism, which equates criticism of Israel and of Zionism as anti-Semitic. This stems from the assumption that Israel represents the collective identity of all Jews, and therefore it hurts and threatens all Jews when Israel and Zionism are being accused of being, for example, a racist endeavor or an apartheid state. I don't have time here to expand on this. Many, me included, have written critically on this issue. Here I just want to comment on two aspects of this development. First, like the other form of Jewish exceptionalism I described above, it makes the issue of solidarity between Jews and other racialized minorities much more difficult, as most local and global anti-racist movements are justly in solidarity with the Palestinians who suffer both exclusionary and exploitative racialized policies and practices against them since the beginning of the Zionist settlement in Palestine at the end of the 19th century. Secondly, like in the case of the Chief Rabbi or the Jewish Board of Deputies, which is constructed as the representative bodies of British Jews, there are significant and growing numbers of self-identified Jews who do not see themselves as supporters of Zionism and Israel, and especially of its occupation policies, and feel cancelled out by the imposition of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which basically homogenize all Jews, not just in terms of their ethnic categorization of belonging, but also of their identification and normative values. When people opposed to apartheid in South Africa, they were not automatically seen as racist towards white South Africans. When the SNP in Scotland calls for the dismantling of the UK, people might disagree with it politically, but not see the party as racist against the English. Which means that in developing effective anti-racist movements against racism against Jews, as well as racism against all racialized groupings in Britain and elsewhere, we need to be careful from applying exceptionalism. We need to be careful against homogenization of the racialized collectivities, and especially the attachments and normative values. We need to create transversal solidarities across borders and boundaries and resist attempts to impose non-critical anti-racist as well as racist narratives and structures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neera, for that really interesting and very nuanced discussion of how anti-Semitism relates to racism, pointing out that racisms come in different forms, and Jewish exceptionalism has dangers for thinking about solidarity of those who experience racisms of different kinds, and pointing out the dangers of homogenizing groups on the basis of certain characteristics or labels, recognizing the intersectional nature of the experience and processes of racism. So thank you. No doubt we'll have some questions and comments later on that. Now we come to our third and final speaker, who is, last but not least, Colin Prescott, whose presentation, as I said before, is on the state, the hostile environment, and Black lives, the case for insurgent social science intervention. And Colin Prescott, over 5 decades, has worked as an academic sociologist, a documentary filmmaker, looking at Black British community struggles against racism and for belonging, a theatre maker, a TV commissioning editor, a cultural animator, specifically in museums, archives, and the heritage sector. Notable 21st century exhibition credits include at the Museum of London, London Sugar and Slavery Permanent Gallery at the Guildhall Art Gallery, London, No Colour Bar, Black British Art in Action, and at the British Library, Windrush, Songs in a Strange Land. He is chair of the Council of the Institute of Race Relations and a member of the editorial working committee of the Institute of Race Relations journal, Race and Class. Thank you.
Thank you, Floya.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, Nira. Thank you, Aftar. Exemplary presentations. I came anxiously to this forum. The question that I begin with is, what's the purpose of this forum? I think they've already had sufficient to give me some answers, but I'm going to go on saying what I promised myself to say anyway on my bits of paper in front of me. Aftar invited me, old friend of mine, Aftar, and I could not say no. And after I'd said yes, I thought, what can I present to this forum of social scientists? I come as a kind of outsider, insider. I, like Malcolm, come with questions drawn from community struggle. And I have a call and answer chant that's common at campaign demonstrations, which seems like a good one to start with here. Say, what do we want? And when do we want it? What do we want? And when do we want it? This chant will have been heard over and over down the years in any number of anti-racist campaign calls. I was born in a colony of the British Empire, Trinidad and Tobago. And from there to here, that chant seems to be at the center of so much of what has been the ordinary struggle life that I've had to come through. I want to talk with you at this forum about agency and about urgency. What do we want? And when do we want it? In other words, what do we want to achieve and how serious are we? Agency and agency. Seems to me, and I'm restricting myself a bit, that this SSAHE forum, and this particular webinar with its Racism in Britain Today title is assembled as a kind of response to 2 recent momentous provocations, so to speak. The 2020 Black Lives Matter moment and movement, and the still current ramping up of what has come to be referred to as the British state's imposition of a hostile environment, in our faces hostile environment. I want to say a little bit about the Black Lives Matter 2020 George Floyd moment, a big moment for a movement. I'm wondering how many of you who are at this webinar will have read the report of a terrific interview with the African-American activist Barbara Ransby, published in the IHRA, the IHRA's journal Race and Class, at the end of 2020. Jenny Bourne, the editor of Race and Class, at the end of has given the title, "This is what a radical intervention could look like." I want you to look at it. I want you to remember it and look at it, because it will say many of the things that I'm not able to say in the few minutes that I'm giving myself at this time. I'm drawing the piece to your attention because of two things that Barbara Ransby makes clear in her interview. The first thing is that Black Lives Matter is a campaign about Black lives as they're actually lived, as well as about Black deaths in state custody, and about much more. Black Lives Matter is not simply about, I say simply, merely about Black deaths, which is what it feels like spurred up that moment, stirred people into responding. The second thing that Barbara Ransby makes clear in that interview is the extraordinary moment of militant demonstration, is that moment in huge numbers of city sites across the USA, which also got initiated other militant demonstrations around the world. Far from being sudden and spontaneous, I'm aware that I'm repeating something that Malcolm tried to remind us of just now. Far from being sudden and spontaneous was evidence of the work done over many years by a Black Lives Matter related network in the States, one which I hadn't thought about before Barbara spoke about it in her interview, something that they call the Movement for Black Lives. It's a radical social change agenda that it has. It is connected to Black Lives Matter, but it's actually a larger movement than the Black Lives Matter related. Read the interview for the detail of what they want and what they wanted when they want it. I've suggested that there have been two major provocations which have thrown up this forum that I'm speaking into now. The Black Lives Matter is one, the other, and I'm repeating things that I've heard both Neera and Malcolm talk about. The other is the current in our faces ramping up of the state's racist hostile environment agenda. The term hostile environment, you will recall, was put into play by now ex-Prime Minister Theresa May when she was directly in charge of the Home Office. And it was central to her government's defense response to the exposure of what has come to be called the Windrush Scandal. Hundreds, literally, of long-standing British residents of Western heritage were being unfairly and indeed illegally discriminated against, hounded, persecuted, even expelled from the country on the basis that they were illegal residents with no right to live here. There'd been community campaigns about such cases, again, over decades. But it was not until journalist Amelia Gentleman, along with some C4 TV, Channel 4 TV journalists, determinedly made these injustices a media story that the Windrush Scandal was declared. It seemed to constitute another clear case of state racism, you'd have thought. No, said the government. No, said the government spokespeople. This was not evidence of racism. This was simply the hostile attitude that the state was obliged to take with regard to sections of the population that included criminals and illegals who happened to be Black. There's hardly need in this forum, I think, to run down the detail of this Windrush episode, so-called, as continuous with the racism experienced by Caribbean migrant settlers from the 20th into the 21st century. I am aware that I'm speaking again over with something that Malcolm's already said. A racist, hostile environment underscored by the state is nothing new for those who live with systematic state practices that finish up disabling, injuring, incarcerating, and regularly delivering deaths in state custody. And there's now something new that has emerged under our new latest version of Conservative Party government. We now have in our faces government campaign to subvert our anti-racist purpose, with the government spokespeople regularly dismissing hard evidence of racist practice as mere perceptions, and accusing those who dwell on the evidence as spinning accusing us of spinning victim ideology that demoralizes, risks demoralizing Black and brown people. I use the phrase Black and brown as distinct from BAME, and because we need phrases to link up these racialisms, as we say. No more of that for the moment, because I've only got a very small time. So I'll move. The point that I'm in danger of laboring is that with even just these two provocative things I'm talking about, the Black Liberation Movement and the exposed hostile environment Windrush Scandal, it's as though for me, the age of innocence and complacency in regard to racism is over. This is the context in which this conference, this forum has emerged. And for social scientists, the time of calling for racism awareness as a strategy for combating racism is over. The time for offering critique of the status quo in purely contemplative academic intellectual mode is over. Anti-racist action has to answer to, has to be accountable to the urgency coming from the street and from communities suffering suffocation and death under racism and a racist state. We need to find ways to be of service to this movement for Black lives. We need not to be just interested, but on board. We need to be engaged with what I'm trying to call change action, with action plans for change. I'm coming quickly to the end of what I've written down. Here's my today's list of suggestions for our change action plans. We need to double our efforts to underline the urgency of the situation in regard to lives as they're actually lived, which includes concern about Black deaths, as well as changing the system. We need to be much more urgent about what's happening to kids who are being excluded in schools, for example. Much more urgent, not just for the kids, but to the communities, the families who are upset by that. We need to be really upset about the rates of incarceration. This is something that goes on generation after. You just have to do the numbers to add up what the impact on communities is of these things going on generation after generation. We need to choose social change activism over social science sidelining, not just reporting on or researching anti-racist practices, but actively engaging in supporting them. And where we're not or can't be on the front lines of struggle ourselves, then we should be working to disable the systems and institutions that oppress. We need to amplify and broadcast the evidential case for urgent transformation interventions. We need to relentlessly expose the state's latest attempts. I don't need to be saying it to some of the people who are already in this forum, but there may be others who are listening who need to be encouraged to do this, to expose the state's latest attempts to impose a compliant environment. How bold-faced they are. They shifted when hostile environment was pointed at. It was clear that they'd given something away by using such a term. And they began to talk about imposing a compliant environment, as though nobody could read through what this meant, as cover for its already admitted hostile environment. We need to join up. And again, I'm repeating things that I heard Neera say, I heard Malcolm say. We need to join up the struggles of the oppressed to make the link up of struggles for everything from Black Lives Matter to Extinction Rebellion. Or as Barbara Ransby puts it so well in that Race and Class interview that I've been mentioning, recognize the intimate and symbiotic connections between race and class and gender struggles. We need, in fact, to radicalize our political culture, to base build for an anti-racist movement. So what do we want? And when do we want it? Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for listening. Can't hear you, Floria.
Where is Nando?
Ah, got you now.
Oh, okay. Because so Nando had me muted, so I couldn't.
Okay, thank you
Well,
very much.
thank you very much, Colin, for that very impassioned and very clear analysis of what's going on in Britain today, and pointing out the atrocities of the state against racialized people, particularly Black people, but that Black people do not stand alone there. The racialized are of many kinds and oppression is of many kinds, and we need to look at the underpinnings within class and exploitation practices as well. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so now I'm going to pass you all on to the safe hands of Rachel Rosen, who will be fielding the questions from the audience.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much to the speakers for your brilliant presentations. Just to say, if you haven't heard yet, I'm going to be trying to collect the questions that you're posting in the chat and posing them to the speaker. So please do go ahead and put any questions in there. I had to start with a question from Maimuna Solomon, and this is a question for all of the speakers. Maimuna is asking, how does intersectionality fit into this discussion topic? I think all of the speakers have hinted at this, but if you might draw out a little bit more the points around intersectionality. Would anybody like to start? I could take you in the order that you choose, or in the order they spoke. Malcolm, would you like to start?
Yeah, that's cool.
Super.
So I think it's important to start with the reality in terms of the BEA Care PSHE movement that I've been more recently involved in. It's the government made it really clear, and I think Nara alluded to this as well, that critical race theory is one of the things that the government do not want engaged with. That has been doubled down in many ways by some of the comments by the Equalities Minister in more recent times. I also need to, obviously, we don't even need to get into the ways in which the Equalities Minister has engaged with our great journalist, Candice Braithwaite, more recently, and that's been widely reported in the press, in press and on social media as well. But the language of intersectionality and the framework of intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw and others, is one which is in many ways in danger of being appropriated by loose talk and loose applications of it. And so, without trying to explain what intersectionality is something that we should investigate and look at, but we should also consider, almost the fundamental question for me is, who is not in the room when we're having the conversation? What are the voices that are not here now? Because there are communities, peoples who are not here. Are those voices included in the not even in the conversation, because we've gone past that? Are those voices included in the decision-making process? Are they included in the structures that we are invested in now, or the ones that we are imagining for the future? I'll stop there and perhaps Nara or Colin can Smith.
Okay, I'll go in because I think that it's very the notion of intersectionality, as Malcolm hinted, has been appropriated and interpreted in different ways. And in some ways, although intersectionality was supposed to be an alternative to essentialist identity politics, it became essentialist fragmented identity politics. And this is exactly what we don't want. We don't want that, and we also cannot equate categories or access of power, social divisions with particular communities, if I might a bit, I'm not sure Malcolm will disagree with me, but maybe we can discuss it, because it's not just a question of invisible communities, but also social divisions within communities, that people kind of, identity politics very often, individuals speak as a Black, as a woman, as a Jew, I can tell you, as if represent everybody without being listening to anybody else, without being voted to represent. This is why when we talk about transversal politics, we say we can talk as advocates of particular communities, not as representatives, unless we actually were elected to be about it. And women very often have been victims of this kind of homogenization of communities. Very much minorities within minorities have been silenced because of this. Of course, solidarity is important, but solidarity has also to be aware that people have different level of articulation, of education, of resources, not just in terms of class, but also culture capital and other ways, and language, of course, is very important. And therefore, when we talk about struggles and resistance, we have to be aware, not and be careful not to homogenize, and in this way, I agree with Malcolm, not to silence those by attempting to speak for everybody. Only by listening and including people in the dialogue, we can actually move forward.
They're wonderful. I'm in the company of great old hands here. Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, Neera. I had a very simple note here, and I don't need to say anymore because you just spoke. My note said, it's easy to say, important to say, and hard to achieve. It's a work in progress. And I think that's what you've just both been talking to. So I have to say no more. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I want to now move on to Deepak Panchal, who's written a long note about a recent experience of being at a forum where, with the Metropolitan Police Force, talking about prevent and other forms of surveillance strategies. And Deepak asks, how can the complicity and compliance of some Black and Brown people in power positions be theorized when they subjugate and denigrate people that look just like them? And then Deepak goes on and mentions Priti Patel as an example. So this is a question for any of the speakers about how do we theorize complicity and compliance? Again, I'm open to order. Does somebody want to jump in?
I don't theorize it. Are you hearing my voice?
Perfect, Colin, go ahead.
I can't theorize it. They have to be called out, and it seems to me, and exposed for what they are. And that's I'm not even thinking of myself here. I'm thinking of people. There's a man whose name it's worth remembering. His name's Gus John, who never misses a beat on publicly calling out the people who are doing exactly this job that the question is asking about. I don't have a theory for them. They're usually, you can see what they're doing. They're lining their own nests. They're making a living. They're betraying the class, the culture, the professional positions that they're holding to. Does it need theory? I'll hush up.
Yeah. I think that you might say you didn't theorize it, Colin, but I do think you pointed out exactly what is being doing, and I think it does relate theoretically and practically to the issue of intersectionality that we just talked about. As long as we kind of assume, we homogenize everybody and assume that people from particular ethnic or race origin should have the same normative values and the same attachment and identity, this is identity politics, then we will be disappointed. If we analyze it intersectionally and see where they're coming from, not just in terms of the intersectional class position or whatever, but what is their values? We shouldn't expect anything from them because they're not part of our solidarity movement, because solidarity movement is built on shared values.
Malcolm, did you want to come in on this one?
Unmute yourself.
You can't unmute.
Thank
Hang
you.
on a second.
Thank you, Nanda.
You're on.
I think Colin and Nara's points are absolutely right. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here. I was speaking to a colleague in the Netherlands earlier on today, and we had this same conversation when reasoning about the state of the world in our respective contexts, and we spoke at length in many ways that I think, to paraphrase, skin folk doesn't make it kinfolk, you know, because you have the same racialized identity as somebody. That does not mean, as Nara's just said, that they share your politics. They don't. It doesn't work like that. That's the fallacy of the thing. But what there may well be is some collective understanding. Am I going to judge? I'm not going to judge Priti Patel or anybody else by their racialized identity. I think we can just judge them by their actions and the work that they do with the agency, positionality, and intention that they've got. That's all we need to do. As soon as we shift into a discourse about this person should know better because we're running down a very slippery slope, even if we believe that. So yeah, I err with caution when being critical. Judge those people on their deeds.
Thanks very much. Just to say there's a lot going on in the chat. I'm trying to keep up with it all. I may not get everybody's question, but I'll do my best. There's a couple of questions or discussion right now happening about Israel and Palestine. And so I'm going to pick up on one of these points. Michael Wolff has said, I am no supporter of Israeli political actions, but I'm puzzled by the fact other countries in the region with arguably hideous human rights behaviors escape the kind of virulent criticisms heaped upon Israel. Israel alone seems to provoke the righteous indignation of the political left. Is this not a form of anti-Jewish bias? There's been some discussion in the chat. So Ophelia Gamliel has responded in some ways to this point. But Nira in particular, I wondered if you wanted to pick up on it, but Malcolm and Colin, you're welcome to as well.
Okay. Of course, I absolutely oppose to what is happening in Saudi Arabia and many other countries, and very happy that Biden, for example, is now going to give some kind of sanctions and not give to the blackmail that all rich countries have been giving it. Not that I have that high expectation from Biden, so don't. However, the issue is not, I don't think that we have to compare it. Israel has become a focus of attention because it also presented itself as a model as a representative of civilization in the Middle East, the only democracy in the Middle East, as well as the only country that have continuous occupation of country, because its settler colonialism happened about 100 years later than most other settler colonialisms. So because of that, there is a focus on that. But definitely in the people that I work politically with, there have never been any kind of endorsement of any of this regime, and there have been a lot of kind of critique. And I don't think that we have, whenever I definitely an Israeli Jew, diasporic as I consider myself to be now, of course, this is a major focus of my activities. Many of the Jewish socialists I work with work on issues of Israel rather than Saudi because of this whole issue, not in my name, because of the identity politics that all supposedly Israel is the collective identity of all Jews and they have to distance themselves with. So I think there are a lot of kind of concrete kind of issues. Definitely, I oppose to this kind of thing, which we talked about, the Priti Patel, that because Jews, Israel is a Jewish state, and Jews have been the victim of racism, and therefore they have to be better than anybody else in the world. They don't. They have to be not worse, and they have to aspire to fill in, you know, human rights and democracy and other values like anybody else, that shouldn't be better than anybody else. So, of course, there can be anti-Semites that cover their anti-Semitism under relating to Israel, but there are a lot of anti-Semites that cover their anti-Semitism by being supporters of Israel. The Christian evangelicals in the United States is the biggest example of contemporary things that's happening now. So I think this is a kind of generalization that very often is used as a red rag in order to distract attention from the actual discussion of what is going on.
Thanks very much, Nira. Just to apologize, it's Ophira, not Ophelia. Ophira made another point in the discussion that's happening, which is that one of the reasons we need to be attuned to a critique of Israel has to do with British colonialism and the ongoing funding of the US. I think that ties quite nicely into all of your presentations, where you spoke about the importance of historicizing systemic racism and historicizing movements, anti-racist movements. And I thought I would move to some of these questions about this historicization, which, taking one from B. Bassi, who says, post-Brexit and move to reinterpret human rights legislation and reform of courts of appeal, Bassi asks, will there be less space to challenge racisms and inequality through the law? And will this open up space for more community activism as we had in the 70s and 80s? Yeah, Malcolm. If you want
Malcolm, it's a two-part question. Could you repeat the first part of that question, please?
Yeah. So the first part is, will there be less space to challenge racisms in the law through legal means?
Yes. My view is that if we connect the actions of appreciating that we are in the middle of this pandemic post-COVID response period, we still have to connect the actions of the current government to the legacies of its past. We were, you know, its root, and from the moment at which there has ever been a national curriculum, for example, within education, or whether there has been those kind of centralized directives from governments, there has been a recognition that discursive, disruptive, critical, decolonial, anti-racist social justice movements are a threat to those institutions. And so therefore limiting those voices, limiting those movements has been absolutely fundamental to the way in which I think our state polices its, or we are policed by the state. We are, and we are policed as educators within those institutions also. So will there be less space? There already is, there already has been. That's why people like me often are speaking when we did face-to-face conversations, we would speak in corridors because there isn't spaces. And even if we wanted to create spaces like the EA, we would have to do that at our own expense, at our own cost. There is no public funding available for this work. You do the work. And so linking it to the second part of the question, which I think related to almost challenges in the future, it's also important to remember that our communities of anti-racist, social justice, decolonial, critical activists, thinkers, teachers, students, we always find ways. We always find our way to challenge. And we do that sometimes through luck and fortune, but often through collective and collaborative endeavor. And those themes are really, really important. They will continue to be important. I would also finally very quickly say the number of initiatives that just within the UK state that have kind of emerged over the last year or so is in many ways a response to that idea that activism from the grassroots is fighting desperately as part of that collaborative and collective movement.
Thanks. Mira or Colin, did you want to say anything more about whether there will be more spaces, if our legal spaces decreasing, spaces for legal action decreasing, and will that lead to more on the ground social movements, community organizing?
I have nothing. Sorry, go on, Nira.
No, I've spoken before, so you speak.
It's okay. I was not going to speak. I was going to say I have nothing to add to what Malcolm said, I'm afraid. The point is that it seems to me the anti-racism that I've been part of has never come from the state. It's never come from the authorities. It's never come from the establishment. The stuff that that we know about has always come from the ground. Britain has been patting itself on the back as being, it's even adopted multicultural society, a leader in Europe for a while, all the rest of it. That reputation only came from the imagination, and I think Malcolm said it before, the courage of people on the ground who stood against indignity, who stood against all that nasty stuff. So if it changes, we change how we fight. That's it.
I don't think I should add anything to what Malcolm Collins said, except maybe to say that the next couple of webinars of SSAHE are going to be focused on Brexit. So obviously these are going to be discussed more there. Yeah.
Great. So we've had a couple of questions that relate to patriotism and nationalism. I'll take Dawn's as a sort of example question here. Dawn writes, he's intrigued by the way state discourses are generating a new version of patriotism and nationalism that is inclusive of certain Black experience, i.e. exemplary success in business and the professions. Doesn't this reinforce the fact that the modern othered racial outsider is increasingly and more narrowly the Black working class? Again, this is a question for any of you, so.
Last bit of the question again.
Yeah. Doesn't this reinforce the fact that the modern othered racial outsider is increasingly and more narrowly the Black working class?
I want to say that around Brexit, They were trying to recruit for Brexiters also Blacks and other settled racialized minorities. A lot of what some of us are calling everyday bordering, which have replaced multiculturalism as a hegemonic technology of control of diversity and discourses of diversity, have differentiated between us and them, included settled minorities in order to have enough support to repulse all the others. Of course, Europe, but also the migrants, many of them have not been part of the British Empire or did not get settled status as part of what was known as NCWP, New Commonwealth and Pakistan. And therefore, the bordering have been a top-down technology of the state, but also were used by the populist right and also to divide also within communities, and especially between the settled and unsettled communities. Nobody is immune from being racist, even if you are a racialized minority itself. So the incorporation of some Blacks in this us versus them does not make the discourse less racist.
And can I be heard?
Yeah.
And nobody is immune from being part of the supporting group for imperialism, capitalism. The other thing that's not inside of it, I didn't see inside of Don's question, was, if you like, the political line about power relations as distinct from racialized relations. And it seems to me where I can usually draw the line between me and others is that I have a particular notion of the bottom line in the system that finishes up oppressing racialized groups and many others. And nobody's to echo Nira, nobody by virtue of the place that they were born in or the color of their skin or whatever else it is immune from tying in to not understanding that there's something at the bottom of all this, the back of all this, that is interested in using racialization and dividing people. Sorry if I'm not very articulate on that one, Don. I didn't quite get the angle of your question.
Malcolm, did you want to say anything in regard to that question?
No, I don't think I could. I want to add anything other than what Naira and Colin have already said.
I'm realizing the time, so we have one last set of questions which are COVID related that I'd like to ask before I give each of the speakers a chance for a last word. So a number of the participants have commented on the racism and exclusion that have been laid bare by the COVID-19 pandemic. Yannick, though, is asking, this is a question for Malcolm specifically, how can the revelation that the global pandemic brought to us about the fact that we are all connected be used effectively in the strategy to decolonize the curriculum? So the point here is not simply that COVID-19 has exposed inequalities, but also that it's also exposed our need for each other. So Yannick is asking about decolonizing the curriculum, Malcolm, and Nira and Colin, I invite you to comment in terms of activism more broadly, if you'd like. And you too, Malcolm.
Yeah, okay. I don't want to say worried. I get nervous whenever I'm in any space where we begin to speak about decolonizing the curriculum, because from my view, it is of course a really complex task. I'm not saying all of this to stop us from engaging in the action. It's just a train of thought that I need to share. And my nervousness is back to that that good old language of appropriation, and the claiming of an action which, in my view, in many cases, doesn't appear to be decolonial, and even its thinking, it, for me, suggests we were not racist, we were racist before, and we are going to be less racist now. And that's a really important distinction. So the reason, and so this is why I talk about the complexity. I think with all of the speakers, I think today, we've all tried to kind of place ourselves somewhere in these discourses and in these struggles. And if we're talking about these ideas of decolonizing our curriculum, much more importantly is to decolonize our structures and seek that critical, radical, emancipatory reform that we all hope and aspire for. Absolutely, we need to be placing in the middle of our conversations a recognition of colonialism, colonizing ways. We need to put in the middle of our conversations white supremacy, name it, say it, consider it. Yep. Which is, and then with all of the pressures and tensions that unfolds, I think of then, I will wrap up really quickly. At the end of when I kind of spoke initially, I spoke about love, bravery, humility, and all of those things as well. And those attributes of progressive teaching, as Paulo Freire would probably say, they have to come to the surface and to the heart of the workers as well. So in terms of post-Brexit, back to that legacy, give it a different name. Many of us have always been trying to do that work. Many of us have been trying to do that work in our individual practice, our individual conversations, with our constant reminders of doing it. And I think probably that's the most important thing. Are we reflecting constantly about the work that we are claiming is decolonial or decolonizing the curriculum? Thanks.
Decolonizing is hard. It's said very easily, repeated a lot, people go at it, but I think it's hard. I'd say it's hard, especially for people who've not had the question put to them in the first place. It's hard for them to take the fact that, as I worked out from a book by a guy that I was reviewing for Race and Class, by Dan Hicks is his name, an archaeologist, prophet, an Oxford professor. It's hard when you read him to realize that the span of Victoria's reign, Queen Victoria's reign, the great Queen Victoria, moved Britain from being a society that was running racial slavery, yes, and claiming, in Victoria's time, claiming that they rid the world, or they became leaders of stopping the slave trade and stopping enslavement of African people. But if you watch the span of Victoria's reign, from 1841 onwards, you realize that it saw the imposition of colonial, exploitative racism in the African continent. 1841, they stopped transporting Africans, and what the state, with the use of joint stock companies, all chartered royally, did was to really absolutely make a terrific and sustained, unforgiving attack on Africans and Africa to take it into colonialism. That is Victoriana. And if you're British and you've been brought up in a certain kind of way, to get you to comprehend that and to process that and to do something with yourself, yes, on that is hard. Seems to me it's hard. And that's, realize I'm not here saying, and so let them off it. I'm just saying, recognize how hard it is. And we actually have to be imaginative. We have to be, we who want to do this, we have to be part of, if you like, almost inventing part of the solution for people who have to make that shift, who are our fellow citizens and all the rest of it. It's hard. I'm not answering the question that was put. I'm responding to what Malcolm said.
Nir, did you want to come in on that particular question?
I think both Malcolm and Colin said lot of very important things about the whole issue of decolonizing the curriculum. From my point of view, as I talked about the three racialized discourses, the imperial, the European, and the nativist, we need also to get rid of the curriculum and way of thought, not just from the imperial discourse, but also the Christian eugenistic, as well as the nativist discourses, and to be very careful. But of course, as pointed out, this is a process that we all struggle and hope to progress in some ways. And unfortunately, we are now in a position that many of us see our lifetime work kind of as a failure because so many things were pushed back, but also hopefully it will be pushed forward again. So this is all the old Gramscian kind of pessimism of the mind and optimism of the soul. Otherwise, especially during this pandemic time, we would all start to howl instead of continue to talk about these things. So that's all what I have to say. Yeah.
Thanks, Nira. So I know we're reaching the end of our time, but I did promise all of the speakers a chance to give a last reflection or comment on the theme of today's discussion, imposing racialized state discourses, racism in Britain today. So just if you had any, not last thoughts, but last thoughts for this webinar.
I think what I just said could do just as well, yeah.
As many of us have realized, almost come to realize, as Nara just said, the work isn't done. But that work isn't just the kind of outward praxis that we do. It is the commitment to reflection that Colin has just kind of alluded to in his previous answer, and reflecting on the legacy work of many across our community, but in particular that of Black educators. It is there is a common thread amongst our elders, which suggests that they didn't hand the keys over early enough. For a variety of reasons. And so coming back to my points at the very beginning, I think it is incumbent on all of us to continue doing our work, continue doing our reflection and our praxis, but absolutely inviting and creating space for our young people, our students, for our community who may not have that position, intention, or agency to get into this space, and give them the opportunity to speak for themselves. So I'm in effect saying, don't invite me next time. There's plenty of people who could come. And I mean that with love and care as well.
Nice.
Thank you.
Nice. And I want to leave the last word with Malcolm. Thank you, Malcolm. Yeah.
Sorry, Malcolm, the last important word is you. I'm just going to wrap up a little bit here.
Okay. So the very last word is shout out to our young people who are in the chat and tweeting right now, talking about this event and showing us lots of love. Hand the keys over to them for an event and see what could emerge and what could happen.
Brilliant. This was a fascinating conversation. Oh, sorry, Colin. Were you going to?
Waving.
Okay. Waving. Okay.
Not drowning.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the speakers for the fascinating, insightful presentations, but also the call to action and reflection. And I think that really highlights the core of what the social science against the hostile environment, the spaces that we're trying to create. And thank you for taking us and the participants through that. And also thank you to the participants for the interesting conversations and questions.